The dust of Coyote Wash tasted of rust and endings. It settled in a fine red powder on the warped planks of the trading post porch, on the cracked leather of the saddlebags leaning against the wall, and on the shoulders of Ashki Nez. He sat with his back to the sun-baked adobe, his eyes half closed against the glare. He was a man carved from the surrounding mesas, his stillness a language the land understood. 30 years had taught him the value of silence, of watching, of feeling the world through the soles of his moccasins. The wind, a low whisper from the east, carried the promise of a storm, a scouring blow that would wipe the slate clean for a day. He ran a thumb over the raised threads of the blanket folded across his lap. It was a battle coat, woven by his grandmother Shandian, its patterns telling stories of the Dean, the people. Each geometric shape was a prayer, a memory of starlight over Canyon de Chelly, a defiant cry against the bitter march to Huildi. His grandmother's voice was a constant presence in his mind, a steady river beneath the noise of the world. Calmness, she had taught him, is the only armor that cannot be pierced. Do not let another man's chaos become your own. It was a lesson learned in the crucible of loss, a truth he held tighter than any weapon. The world of the white man, the Bilagana, had its own rules, its own frenzied pace. It was a world that had taken much and given nothing but treaties written on brittle paper. He did not seek to be part of it. He sought only to live on the land that was his, to honor the ways of his ancestors, and to keep the memory of their long walk from fading into the dust. The trading post door, hanging crooked on one hinge, flew open with a bang that startled the flies from their lazy circles. A woman stumbled inside, not so much running as falling forward, propelled by a fear that had consumed all her strength. She was young, perhaps 22 summers, with hair the color of sun-cured hay pulled loose from its pins. Her dress, a simple blue calico, was torn at the hem and coated with the same red dust that covered everything. But it was her eyes that held Ashki's gaze. They were wide with terror, yet in their depths, a desperate fire still burned. She was a cornered animal, but not a broken one. She pressed herself against a stack of flour sacks, her chest heaving as she fought for breath. Through the open doorway, 3 men appeared, their shapes dark against the blinding sunlight. They did not hurry. Their movements were lazy, confident, the predatory saunter of men who knew their power was bought and paid for. The first, a man with a bloated face and a stained duster, grinned, showing yellowed teeth. His name was Silas, and his cruelty was as plain as the sweat stains on his hat. The other 2 were shadows, blank-faced and carrying their pistols with an easy familiarity. The air in the small trading post grew thick and still. The proprietor, a nervous man named Miller, froze behind his counter, his hands hovering over a crate of tinned peaches. This was Beaumont Kane's business, and in this part of the territory, what Kane wanted, he got. His ambition stretched along the iron rails of the new railroad, a shadow falling over homesteads and tribal lands alike. These men were the instruments of that ambition. Silas took a step toward the woman. He said she had been a fool to run. Mr. Kane only wanted to talk. His voice was a greasy drawl, meant to soothe but succeeding only in sounding more menacing. The woman, Eliza Hart, shook her head, clutching a worn leather ledger to her chest as if it were a shield. She told him to stay away from her. Her voice was a ragged whisper, but it was clear. Ashki watched. This was not his fight. It was a Bilagana quarrel, a dispute over their papers and their greed. He had seen it 100 times. It always ended in sorrow. The memory of Huildi, the Bosque Redondo, rose in him, a cold tide of helplessness. They had been forced to walk, driven from their sacred lands, starved and broken, because of papers and greed. Why should he spill his blood, or even his peace? For one of them, he could rise, walk out the back, and be gone before the dust storm hit. He could disappear into the canyons where the white man's law was a joke. But then he saw the way Silas looked at her. It was a look of ownership, of a man savoring the fear of a creature caught in his trap, and he saw the trembling in Eliza's hands as she clutched the ledger, the sheer force of will it took for her not to collapse. Shandian's voice came to him again, softer this time. A person's dignity is their holy place. To watch it be defiled and do nothing is to defile your own. With a slowness that defied the tension in the room, Ashki-Nez stood up. He was not a large man, but he moved with a grounded certainty that made him seem taller. He took 2 silent steps forward, placing himself between the woman and the 3 men. He did not speak. He did not draw the knife at his belt. He simply stood, a calm obstruction. Silas stopped. His grin faltered, replaced by a sneer of disbelief. He told Ashki to step aside. This was not his concern. Ashki's eyes, dark and steady, met his. The world outside the door was turning a pale, hazy orange. The wind moaned as it swept around the corner of the building. He unfolded the heavy blanket from his arm. The intricate patterns of black, red, and white seemed to hold the last of the day's light. With a gentle movement, he draped it over Eliza's shoulders. The thick wool settled around her, a tangible promise of sanctuary. She flinched at his touch, then looked up at him, her terrified eyes asking a question he could not yet answer. The gesture was a clear defiance. It was a line drawn in the dust of the floor. Silas's face hardened. He addressed Ashki with a slur, calling him a redskin and telling him he had just made a fatal mistake. He and his friends were taking the girl and the book she stole. Ashki's voice, when it came, was low and even, the sound of stones rubbing together at the bottom of a river. He said, "She is not going with you." For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the rising howl of the wind. Silas's hand drifted toward his pistol. The 2 men behind him shifted their weight, their eyes darting from Ashki to the door. They were bullies, not fighters, and the Navajo's unnerving calm was something their simple brutality could not understand. He did not look afraid. He did not look angry. He looked patient, as if he could stand there until the mesas crumbled to dust. The first gust of the storm hit the trading post like a physical blow, rattling the windows and sending a cascade of sand through the cracks in the door. It was the moment Ashki had been waiting for. His movement was a blur. He did not attack. He simply kicked the leg of a nearby table laden with sacks of beans and tins of coffee. The table crashed over, spilling its contents across the floor with a deafening clatter. In the instant of surprise, while Silas and his men flinched from the noise, Ashki grabbed Eliza's arm. His grip was firm, inescapable. He said now. He pulled her toward the door. One of the men recovered enough to draw his gun, but he was too slow. They were outside, plunged into a churning world of red dust and screaming wind. Visibility dropped to a few feet. The sun was gone, blotted out by the storm. The angry shouts of the men were instantly snatched away by the gale. As they ran, stumbling through the thickening sand, Eliza's grip on the ledger loosened. It fell open in her hands, the pages whipping wildly in the wind. On the last page of a long column of figures, next to the elegant signature of Beaumont Kane, was a dark, greasy smudge. It was the clear, unmistakable impression of a thumbprint, a mark of illiterate certainty on a document of sophisticated theft. Ashki pulled her on, his body a shield against the worst of the wind. The trading post vanished behind them, swallowed by the storm. They were alone, 2 strangers bound by a single act of defiance, running from a man's greed into the raw, unforgiving heart of the desert. The battle coat, a shield woven with the prayers of his grandmother, whipped around them, a beacon of impossible hope in the growing darkness. The journey for justice had begun, not with a gunshot, but with the quiet unfolding of a blanket. The storm died as quickly as it had been born, its fury spent. It scoured the landscape and moved on, leaving behind a world washed clean and silent under a sky suddenly crowded with stars. The air was cold now, sharp with the scent of damp sage and wet earth. The mesas rose around them like the bones of sleeping giants, their stark silhouettes etched against the deep indigo of the night. Ashki stopped, his head tilted, listening not just with his ears but with his entire body. There was no sound of pursuit, only the low whisper of the wind settling in the canyons and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. He had put enough distance and chaos between them and Cain's men for now. But the night and the desert were enemies of a different sort, patient and unforgiving. Eliza leaned against a slab of sandstone, her breath still coming in ragged bursts. The battle coat was a heavy weight on her shoulders, but its warmth was a comfort against the sudden chill. She looked out at the vast, intimidating darkness, a landscape that seemed to swallow the light of the stars. Back east, a night like this would have been filled with the sounds of crickets and frogs. Here, the silence was a presence, a vast emptiness that made her feel terrifyingly small. Ashki turned to her. His face was unreadable in the faint starlight. He said, "We must find water." He spoke as if it were the simplest thing in the world, like finding a street in a city. He started walking again, his steps sure and quiet on the rocky ground. Eliza pushed herself away from the rock and followed, her city shoes slipping on the loose gravel. He led her not in a straight line, but in a winding path that seemed to follow an invisible logic. He paused to crumble soil between his fingers, to study the curl of a dry leaf on a stunted bush. He pointed to a faint line of darker green vegetation clinging to the base of a rock formation. He said, "Where these grow? Water is near. It drinks deep." He followed the line of plants into a narrow arroyo, a dry wash carved by countless flash floods. The sand was still damp from the recent storm. After a few hundred yards, he stopped and began to dig with his hands at a place where the wash curved. Eliza watched, bewildered. A foot down, the sand grew dark and cool. Then a small puddle of cloudy water seeped into the bottom of the hole. Ashki let it settle, then scooped some into his cupped hands. He tasted it first, then nodded. He offered her the first drink. The water was gritty and tasted of minerals, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. It was life. They drank their fill, and Ashki filled a small water skin he carried at his belt. As they rested, he pointed to a series of delicate tracks in the damp sand near their small well. He said, "Coyote, they are hunting, but they will not trouble us. They fear men more than they need them." He showed her how the tracks were different from a dog's, the way the pads were aligned, the purposeful stride. He said, "To live here, you must learn to read the land. It is a book that tells you where to find shelter, where to find water, and where to find your enemies." Eliza looked from the tracks to Ashki's calm face. In a few short hours, her world had been stripped down to its most basic elements: thirst, fear, and the quiet presence of the man who had saved her. He was teaching her a new language, one written in dust and stone. She was a woman who understood numbers and ledgers, the neat, predictable lines of a balance sheet. This world was all curves and shadows, instinct and survival. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than terror. It was a fragile, tentative curiosity. They walked on through the night. The cold deepened, seeping into their bones. Ashki eventually led her to a fissure in a towering cliff face, a crack so narrow it was almost invisible. They slipped inside, entering a slot canyon. The walls were smooth and sculpted by water, soaring hundreds of feet above them, so close together that they could only see a thin ribbon of starry sky. The air inside was still and protected. It felt like a church. Ashki gathered a small pile of dry juniper wood from a high ledge where a flood had deposited it years ago. With a flint and steel, he coaxed a tiny flame to life. The fire was small, almost smokeless, but its light and heat were a miracle. It pushed back the immense darkness and held the cold at bay. He took out a strip of dried meat and a small cake of ground corn from a pouch. He broke them in half and gave her a share. The food was tough and plain, but it quieted the anxious knot in her stomach. They ate in silence. The only sounds, the soft crackle of the fire and their own breathing echoing off the canyon walls. The warmth and the relative safety of the canyon seemed to unlock something in Eliza. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her belly, but the story of how she had come to be in this place needed to be told. She looked at Ashki, whose eyes reflected the dancing flames. She began to speak, her voice low and hesitant at first. Then, gaining strength, she told him about her job with the railroad, how she had been proud of her skill with numbers, of the responsibility given to her. She had believed in the railroad, in the idea of progress it represented. Then she had found the discrepancies, small at first, then larger. Payments for land that was never for sale. Deeds signed with the names of men who had been dead for years, all of it traced back to Beaumont Kane. He was not just buying land. He was creating false titles, seizing grazing areas, and pushing families, both white and Navajo, off their ancestral homes. The ledger she carried was the proof, a secret record of his fraudulent transactions. Her voice trembled as she continued. When Mr. Kane realized she knew, he had tried to buy her silence with promises of wealth. When that failed, he tried a different approach. He was a widower, a powerful man. He had offered her marriage. It was not a proposal of love. It was a threat, a way to own her, to bind her to him and his secrets. He would have made her a prisoner in a fine house, her life another one of his possessions. Running was the only choice she had left. When she finished, a heavy silence settled between them. Ashki stared into the fire, his expression unchanged. For a moment, Eliza worried he had not been listening, that he thought her a fool for getting involved in such dangerous affairs. But then he spoke, his voice quiet. He said, "My grandmother, Shandin, was a weaver. She taught me that a life is like a rug. There are threads of joy and threads of sorrow. Sometimes, another person tries to force a dark thread into your pattern, to make it ugly, to make it theirs." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and clear. He said, "You refuse to let him. You cut his thread. That is not foolishness. That is strength." He told her about Shandin, about her wisdom and her resilience in the face of suffering. He said she survived the long walk to Huildi. She watched many of our people die from starvation and sickness. The soldiers tried to break her spirit, to fill her with fear and hate, but she would not let them. She told me that your dignity is the one thing no one can take from you unless you give it away. She would sit and weave, her face calm, even when her heart was breaking. She said calmness is an armor. A man who is shouting has already lost the battle. A man who is still, who watches, who thinks, he is the one who holds the power. Hearing him speak of his grandmother, of the immense sorrow his people had endured, put her own fear into a new perspective. She was fighting for her freedom, for justice. He was the survivor of a war against his entire way of life. A fragile thread of understanding began to weave itself between them in the firelight. They were from different worlds, but they both knew what it was to be hunted. As dawn approached, painting the thin strip of sky above them in shades of pearl and rose, Ashki extinguished the fire and scattered the ashes. It was time to move again. He stepped outside the canyon entrance to scout the path ahead. Eliza stood and stretched, her muscles stiff and sore. The battle coat felt less like a borrowed thing now, more like a part of her own fragile defense against this harsh world. Ashki returned a few minutes later, his face grim. He knelt, pointing to a set of prints in the sand not far from the canyon's mouth. They were not the clumsy boot prints of men like Silas. These were the tracks of a single man wearing moccasins, a man who moved with a light, efficient grace. The print was deep, the stride long and confident. "He is a tracker," Ashki said, his voice low. "Ute, I know his work. Kane has not given up. He has sent a wolf after us, not his usual dogs." Eliza's heart sank. A skilled tracker, in this vast, open land. A man like that could follow them anywhere. Their desperate flight had just become a calculated hunt. She looked at Ashki, expecting to see defeat in his eyes. Instead, She saw a new alertness, a sharpening of his focus. The challenge had been met. He looked from the tracks toward the rising sun, which was beginning to cast long shadows from the mesas. He said, "We will not outrun him, so we must outthink him." His eyes met hers, and in them she saw not a promise of safety, but a shared resolve, a flicker of trust, born in the desperation of the trading post and nurtured by the shared warmth of a small fire, had taken root. It was a thin and delicate thing, but in the unforgiving light of the desert morning, it was all they had. They traveled for another day, moving east toward the jagged blue line of the Chuska Mountains. Ashki navigated through a maze of canyons and across sun-blasted plains, always finding the hidden paths, the routes that offered the most cover. He was no longer just fleeing. He was leading them to a specific place, a sanctuary he called the Camp of the Cottonwoods. They arrived as the sun was setting, casting long, peaceful shadows across a narrow valley. A small, clear stream cut through the land, and along its banks grew a grove of ancient cottonwood trees, their leaves rustling like 1,000 quiet conversations in the evening breeze. Nestled amongst the trees were several hogans, traditional dome-shaped dwellings made of earth and logs, their doorways facing east to greet the morning sun. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting meat, and the damp, sweet scent of the stream. It was a place of deep and abiding peace, a world away from the dust and violence of Coyote Wash. An old woman emerged from the largest hogan. Her face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, each line telling a story of laughter, sorrow, and survival. Her silver hair was tied back in a traditional bun, and she moved with a slow, deliberate grace that belied her age. This was Shandian, Ashki's grandmother. She was not the frail woman of his stories, but the living heart of this small community. Her dark eyes took in the scene before her grandson, weary but unharmed, and the strange white woman standing beside him, wrapped in the family's battle coat. There was no surprise in her expression, only a deep, knowing calm. She looked at Eliza, not with suspicion, but with a searching gaze that seemed to see past the torn dress and the fear to the person huddled within. Ashki spoke to her in the soft, flowing cadences of the Dine language. He explained what had happened in a few short, direct sentences. Shandian listened, her head nodding slightly. When he finished, she stepped forward and placed a warm, dry hand on Eliza's arm. Her voice was like the rustling cottonwood leaves, soft but clear. She said, "You are welcome here. You are safe." Another man joined them, coming from the direction of a small corral where several horses stood. He was about Ashki's age, with a strong, solid build and a watchful expression. This was Nathan Chi, Ashki's oldest friend. He greeted Ashki with a firm clasp of the arm, a silent exchange of respect and concern passing between them. His eyes, however, lingered on Eliza. His gaze was not hostile, but it was guarded, filled with the skepticism of a man who had seen too many Bilagana bring trouble to his people. That night, Eliza shared a meal of mutton stew and warm, flat cornbread inside Shandian's hogan. The small space was warm and clean, the air fragrant with the scent of cedar and wool. Woven blankets in brilliant colors were stacked against the curved walls, and a small fire burned in a pit at the center, the smoke rising through a hole in the roof. The trauma of the past 2 days began to recede, replaced by a profound sense of exhaustion and a gratitude so deep it was almost painful. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was entirely new to Eliza. It was a life of purpose, dictated by the sun and the seasons, not the ticking of a clock. Shandian, seeing the restlessness beneath Eliza's exhaustion, gently guided her into the work of the camp. She took her to a large, upright loom where a half-finished blanket was stretched. The pattern was complex, a series of interlocking diamonds and crosses. Shandian showed her how to pass the shuttle, how to tamp the threads down with a wooden comb, how to feel the tension of the wool with her fingertips. At first, Eliza's hands were clumsy. She was used to the precise, intellectual work of numbers, not the physical, intuitive labor of the loom. But she persisted. The rhythmic thump of the comb, the soft scrape of the shuttle, the earthy smell of the lanolin in the wool. All of it began to soothe the frayed edges of her nerves. She found a strange comfort in the simple, honest work, in creating something beautiful and useful with her own hands. Shandian would watch her, offering a quiet word of correction or a nod of approval. She told Eliza that weaving is like thinking. You must see the pattern in your mind before you can make it in the world. You are weaving your own story now. Eliza also learned to cook, to grind corn into meal between two stones, to make stew with wild herbs that Shandian taught her to find along the stream. She watched the women perform a small ritual of thanks each morning, sprinkling a pinch of sacred corn pollen to the four directions, a quiet acknowledgement of the earth's generosity. It was a world of deep, interconnected faith, a stark contrast to the transactional religion she had known back east. Here, divinity was not in a building, but in the land, the water, and the sky. After a week, their supplies of salt and coffee ran low. Ashki announced that he and Eliza needed to go into the nearest town, San Miguel, for provisions and ammunition. Nathan argued against it, his distrust of the outside world clear in his voice. He said, "It is too dangerous. Cain's men will be looking for you." Ashki was resolute. He said, "We cannot hide forever, and we need to know what Cain is planning." Eliza, though frightened at the prospect of leaving the sanctuary of the camp, agreed. Hiding would not stop Cain. The ledger in her bag was a weapon, and it was useless if they did not learn how and when to use it. San Miguel was a single dusty street baked by the sun, lined with false-fronted wooden buildings. It was a town built on desperation and hurry, a place where money was the only law that mattered. The moment they rode into town, Eliza felt the change. The peaceful silence of the camp was replaced by the noise of shouting men, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, and the tinny, mournful music drifting from a saloon. The stares started immediately. Men stopped their conversations to watch them pass. Their gazes were hard and unfriendly, lingering on Ashki with a mixture of contempt and fear, and on Eliza with a crude, assessing curiosity. She felt the weight of their prejudice like a physical blow. In the camp, she was a guest, a student. Here, she was an outcast, a white woman with a Navajo man, an offense to the town's unspoken rules. They went first to the general store. The proprietor, a man with a sour face and stained apron, served them with a grudging slowness, placing their goods on the counter as if they were contaminated. He overcharged them for the salt and the bullets, and when Ashki quietly pointed out the discrepancy, the man merely shrugged and said, "That is the price." There was no point in arguing. As they left the store, they saw the town sheriff leaning against a post outside the saloon. He was a big man with a florid face and a tin star pinned crookedly on his vest. A well-dressed man, one Eliza recognized as one of Cain's lieutenants from the railroad office, walked up to the sheriff, spoke a few words, and discreetly pressed a thick envelope into his hand. The sheriff palmed it without looking and gave a slight nod. The transaction was seamless, practiced. The law in San Miguel was for sale, and Beaumont Cain was the highest bidder. A chill went through Eliza that had nothing to do with the heat of the day. The forces arrayed against them were not just a few hired thugs, but the very structure of power in this territory. Later, while Ashki arranged to have a horseshoe replaced, Eliza found a quiet spot in the shade of the livery stable to wait. She took out the ledger, needing to reconnect with the reason for all this danger. She ran her fingers over the columns of numbers, the tangible proof of Cain's crimes. As she turned a page, her finger brushed against a faint, greasy impression in the paper near the bottom, next to an entry detailing the purchase of water rights near Canyon de Chelly. She had seen it before, but had dismissed it as just another smudge. Now, looking closer, she saw its shape. It was not random. there was a faint circular border, and inside, the raised image of an eagle clutching a set of scales. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the faint imprint of a wax seal, transferred from another document onto the ledger by a greasy thumb. She had seen that seal before, embossed on legal papers in the railroad office. It was the official seal of Judge Marcus Thorne, the circuit judge for the San Miguel district. The connection hit her with the force of a physical shock. The judge was not just turning a blind eye to Kane's activities. He was an active participant. His seal of justice was being used to legitimize the theft. This changed everything. Their fight was not just against a greedy cattle baron, but against a corrupt legal system. When Ashki returned, he saw the look on her face. He asked, "What is it?" She showed him the faint impression, her finger trembling as she traced its outline. She said, "This is a judge's seal. Judge Thorne. He is working with Kane." Ashki stared at the mark for a long time, his face a mask of grim understanding. The news did not surprise him. He had never expected fairness from the white man's law. But this was different. This was concrete proof. Another thread they could pull to unravel Kane's entire web of deceit. As they rode out of San Miguel, leaving the dust and the hate behind them, Eliza overheard two men talking near the saloon. Their voices were low, but the words carried on the dry air. They spoke of a big land auction coming up, the biggest this territory had ever seen. Beaumont Kane was putting up thousands of acres, prime grazing land with good water. The deeds were all freshly signed and stamped by the judge himself. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The ledger was not just a record of past crimes. It was the key to preventing a future one. Kane was about to consolidate his power, to use his stolen deeds to gain legal, irreversible control of the land. They did not have much time. Their small, personal fight for survival had just become a race against the clock to save a future for countless others. The community at the camp had given her a safe place to heal. Now, with this new knowledge, she understood that true safety could only come from confronting the source of the sickness, not just hiding from its symptoms. The news from San Miguel settled like a shroud over the peaceful camp. The auction was not a distant threat. It was a blade poised to fall. That evening, as the fire crackled and the cottonwood leaves whispered secrets to the stars, Nathan returned from a long ride, his face set in grim lines. He had followed the trail of a supply wagon and had seen the place they called Crow's Gulch. It was a box canyon, easily defended, where a dozen of Kane's men were camped. But they were not just guarding supplies. He had seen women there, he said, his voice low with disgust. Mexican women from a village to the south whose lands had been seized, and a few young Dine women who had been taken while gathering herbs. They were being held, forced to cook and serve the men, their spirits being broken day by day. Eliza listened, the ledger in her lap feeling as heavy as a tombstone. The numbers and names on its pages were not abstract entries anymore. They were connected to this, to the faces of the women Nathan described, to the casual cruelty of a man who saw people as nothing more than assets to be used and discarded. Her fear, a constant companion since she fled the railroad office, was suddenly eclipsed by a hot, sharp anger. Ashki watched her. He saw the shift in her eyes, the hardening of her jaw. He saw the girl who had stumbled into the trading post transform into a woman ready to fight. He knew, without a word being spoken between them, that they could not leave those women in that canyon. To expose the fraud in the ledger while ignoring the human suffering it caused would be a hollow victory. The decision was made in the quiet understanding that passed between the three of them. This was a risk that had to be taken. Shandine, who had been listening from her place by the fire, said nothing against it. Her silence was a form of consent, an acknowledgement that sometimes peace must be defended with action. They prepared as the moon rose, a silver sliver in the dark sky. Ashki gathered weapons, his bow and a quiver of arrows fletched for silence, his knife and a sturdy rifle. Nathan did the same. Ashki then approached Eliza, holding out a small, heavy pistol. It was simple, a Colt Peacemaker, its metal cool and businesslike. "He said you may need this." His voice was steady, practical. He showed her how it worked, how to load the cartridges, how to pull back the hammer, how to aim. Her hands felt clumsy and alien holding the weapon. The weight of it was the weight of a choice she never wanted to make. She looked at him, her eyes wide with apprehension. "He said aim for something big, something that is not a man, a horse, a wagon, the ground. Frighten them. Make them run. Do not try to kill. Killing is a sickness that is hard to cure." Before they left, Shandian called Ashki to her side. She pressed a knife into his hand. It was old, its handle worn smooth from use, the blade of dark, forged steel. It was the knife she used for skinning game, for cutting roots, for severing the threads on her loom. She said, "This is not a weapon for hate. It is a tool for cutting what is rotten, for freeing what is tangled. Use it with a clear heart." Her words were not just for him, they were for all of them. A blessing on their dangerous mission. The ride to Crow's Gulch was a journey through a world of shadows. They moved without speaking, their horses' hooves muffled on the sandy soil. The air grew colder as they climbed into the rocky highlands, smelling of pine and cold stone. Ashki led them to a high ridge overlooking the Box Canyon. Below, a single large campfire burned, a malevolent orange eye in the darkness. It cast flickering shadows on a large tent, a supply wagon, and a dozen rough-looking men who were drinking and laughing loudly. Near the back of the canyon, tethered like animals, was a smaller, ragged tent from which no light or sound emerged. That was where the women were being held. The plan was born of Ashki's intimate knowledge of such places. Nathan, the strongest of them, would circle around to the far side of the canyon on Ashki's signal. A low owl hoot. He would send a few boulders crashing down the scree slope. The diversion would draw most of the men. In the confusion, Ashki would move through the camp, a silent shadow, to neutralize the guards who remained. Eliza's task was the most vital. She was to go to the main tent, where a lamp still burned. Kane's men were careless. Nathan had seen one of them carrying a leather portfolio. It had to contain the maps and plans for the land auction. After securing the portfolio, she was to go to the women's tent and cut them free. They tethered their horses and moved down the slope on foot, ghosts in the moonlight. Every snapped twig, every dislodged pebble sounded like a thunderclap in the tense silence. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the quiet night. She clutched the cold metal of the pistol in her coat pocket, its weight both a burden and a strange reassurance. They took their positions. Time seemed to stretch and thin. Eliza crouched behind a cluster of boulders, watching the fire, the men's faces ugly and distorted in the dancing light. She thought of their laughter, their casual cruelty, and the fear the women in that tent must be feeling. Courage, she told herself, was not the absence of fear. It was just putting fear in its proper place, behind the thing that had to be done. Ashki's owl hoot was so perfect, so natural, that for a moment Eliza thought it was a real bird. An instant later, a deafening roar echoed from the far side of the canyon as Nathan sent the rocks tumbling. The men at the fire jumped to their feet, grabbing rifles and shouting in alarm. Most of them ran toward the sound of the rock slide, their boots crunching on the gravel. As Ashki melted into the shadows of the camp, Eliza took a deep breath and ran, her body low to the ground. Toward the main tent, the canvas flap was open. Inside, a single lantern cast a warm glow on a crude table. And there it was, a handsome leather portfolio, embossed with Beaumont Kane's initials. She snatched it up. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She tucked it securely under her arm and slipped back out into the night. She could hear a muffled shout, then silence, from the direction of the campfire. Ashki was at work. She ran to the women's tent. The flap was tied shut with a thick rope. Using the knife Shandian had given Ashki, which he had passed to her, she sawed at the fibers. The rope fell away. She pulled back the flap. In the dim moonlight filtering through the canvas, she saw them. 8 women, huddled together on the dirt floor, their faces etched with a mixture of terror and exhausted despair. When they saw her, a white woman with a knife in her hand, they flinched back. Eliza's voice was a ragged whisper.
"She said, I am here to help you. We have to go, now."
One of the men who had stayed behind, a big man with a greasy beard, came around the corner of the tent. His eyes widened when he saw her, then narrowed with a cruel grin. He said, "Well, look what we have here." He started toward her, his intentions clear. Panic seized Eliza. Her mind went blank. The man lunged. She stumbled backward, pulling the pistol from her pocket. She raised it with both hands, the barrel shaking wildly. Ashki's words echoed in her mind. "Aim for something big." The man laughed and kept coming. A wagon stood nearby, its large wooden wheel a dark circle against the night. She squeezed her eyes shut and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the recoil slamming her shoulder. The bullet splintered the wooden spokes of the wheel with a loud crack. The man froze, his grin vanishing. The unexpected violence of the gunshot had startled him. In that moment of hesitation, a shadow detached itself from the side of the tent. Ashki was there. The man had no time to cry out. Ashki's arm wrapped around his neck, and he was pulled back into the darkness. Eliza stood frozen, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils. Her entire body was trembling. The women were now staring at her with a new expression awe. She had not just freed them, she had fought for them. Ashki appeared at her side. He placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. The simple touch was enough to bring her back from the edge. It was a silent acknowledgement of what she had done, of the line she had crossed. His voice was calm. He said, "Good. Now we go." They herded the frightened but hopeful women out of the tent and toward the mouth of the canyon. Nathan was there, a rifle in his hands, guarding their escape route. They had almost made it to the rocks where their horses were hidden when a figure appeared on the ridge above them, silhouetted against the moon. It was the Ute tracker. He held a rifle, and it was aimed directly at them, at Eliza. There was no escape. They were caught. Ashki pushed Eliza behind him, shielding her with his body. He stood perfectly still, facing the man on the ridge. The tracker did not fire. For a long, heart-stopping moment, he simply stood there. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered the barrel of his rifle. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod in Ashki's direction. Ashki returned the gesture. A silent conversation had passed between them, a message of debts and loyalties that transcended the conflict of the moment. The tracker turned and vanished into the darkness as silently as he had appeared. They did not wait to understand. They scrambled up the rocks, mounted their horses, and, with the rescued women riding double, they galloped into the night, leaving the chaos and violence of Crow's Gulch behind. Eliza clutched the leather portfolio, its contents a promise of a different kind of justice. The pistol was still in her hand, warm now, a terrifying and empowering weight. She was still afraid, but it was a different kind of fear. It was the fear of a fighter, not a victim. In saving others, she had finally begun to save herself. The return to the camp of the Cottonwoods was a quiet triumph. The rescued women, though still haunted by their ordeal, walked with a newfound lightness, their faces turned toward the rustling leaves and the promise of safety. They were absorbed into the small community with a gentle, unquestioning welcome. Shandian embraced each one, her presence a balm on their wounded spirits. For 2 days, a fragile peace settled over the valley. The portfolio of maps and fraudulent deeds lay hidden, a coiled serpent waiting for its moment. In the evenings, the sound of more voices joined the songs around the fire. It felt like a healing, a small victory against the darkness that Beaumont Kane was spreading across the land. The attack came at dawn, the hour of ghosts and new beginnings. There was no warning. One moment, the sky was the soft gray of a dove's wing. The next, it was torn apart by the thunder of hooves and the crack of rifles. Kane's men did not ride in yelling like wild men. They came with a cold, terrifying efficiency, a dozen riders appearing from the mouth of the valley as if summoned from the earth itself. They were not there to fight. They were there to destroy. They set fire to the hay stored for the horses, sending a pillar of thick black smoke into the clean morning air. They drove the small herd of sheep into the stream, their shots echoing off the canyon walls. It was an act of pure malice, a message written in fear and destruction. Ashki and Nathan were the first to react, grabbing their rifles and returning fire from the cover of the rocks. Their shots were precise, aimed to drive the attackers back, not to start a massacre. Inside the main hogan, Eliza worked with the other women to herd the terrified children to the back, away from the doorway. Shandian stood in the entrance of her own dwelling, her face a mask of sorrowful calm. She was not a warrior, but she would not cower. She was the heart of this place, and she would not let its spirit be broken by terror. A stray bullet, fired indiscriminately by one of Cain's men, ricocheted off a stone near the doorway. A splinter of rock, sharp as a shard of glass, flew through the air and struck her high on the chest. She did not cry out. She simply staggered back, a hand pressed to the wound, her calm expression finally clouding with pain. The raid was over as quickly as it began. Seeing that they had made their point, the riders galloped away, their cruel laughter swallowed by the thunder of their horses. They left behind a scene of chaos, a burning haystack, scattered sheep, and a silence more terrifying than the noise of the attack. Ashki found his grandmother inside her hogan, lying on her sleeping pallet. Eliza was already there, trying to stop the bleeding with a strip of clean cloth. The wound itself was small, but it was deep, and Shandian's breathing was shallow. The light was already beginning to fade from her eyes. She looked at Ashki, and her gaze was not one of pain, but of profound love and a deep, weary acceptance. He knelt beside her, his hands, usually so steady, trembling as he took hers. The guilt that washed over him was a physical force, a crushing weight that stole the air from his lungs. This was his fault. He had brought this trouble, this violence, to her doorstep. He had brought Eliza here, and in doing so, had painted a target on the one place he held sacred. Shandian seemed to read his thoughts. Her fingers tightened weakly on his. She spoke in the Dine language, her voice a fragile whisper. "Do not carry this. My path was woven long ago. This is but the final thread." She turned her eyes to Eliza, who was weeping silently. "And you," she said, her voice now in English for Eliza's benefit. "You are a weaver now, too. You must finish your pattern." Through the rest of the day and into the long, cold night, they kept vigil. Nathan and the others guarded the camp, but no one returned. Cain had delivered his blow. Inside the hogan, the air grew thick with the scent of burning cedar and the low, murmuring sound of prayers. They did not try to save her body with the white man's medicine. They helped to ease the journey of her spirit with the old songs, the ancient words that had guided the Dine through sorrow for generations. She passed just as the moon reached its highest point, a sliver of cold, white light in the sky. Her last breath was a quiet sigh, a release. The deep lines of pain on her face softened into a final, profound peace. The pillar of Ashki's world had crumbled. In the days that followed, a terrible silence fell over him. He performed the necessary rituals of mourning with a numb precision, but his spirit had withdrawn to a place no one could reach. He moved like a shadow, his eyes dark with a pain so deep it was bottomless. He saw his grandmother's face in the flickering fire, heard her voice in the rustling of the cottonwoods, and every time, the guilt returned, a serpent coiling in his gut. The long walk had not broken his people's spirit, but this single death felt as if it had broken his. One evening, he found Eliza by the stream, staring into the dark, swirling water. He stood behind her, a figure carved from the surrounding darkness. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough, devoid of all its former warmth. He said, "You must go." Eliza turned to face him. His face was a mask of anguish. She said, "What are you talking about?" He took a step back, as if her presence was a physical pain. He said, "I can take you to the fort at Wingate, or to the rail line. Far from here. You will be safe. I have brought this on you. On her. On all of us. Everything I touch is now tainted with Cain's poison." His words were stones, each one a testament to his guilt. He was trying to protect her, but he was doing it by severing the one connection that was holding him together. He was consumed by the old fear, the fear of loss, so great that he would choose to be alone rather than risk it again. Eliza looked at him, at this strong, calm man now shattered by grief. She saw past the guilt to the love that was fueling it, and in that moment, her own fear and grief fell away, replaced by a fierce, unwavering clarity. She stepped forward, closing the distance he had tried to create between them. She reached out and took his hand. His first instinct was to pull away, but she held on, her grip surprisingly strong. She said, "No, I am not leaving." She looked directly into his eyes, forcing him to see her, to hear her. She said, "Your grandmother told me to finish my pattern. That is not something I can do alone, hiding in some city back east. My pattern is here now." She squeezed his hand. Her voice dropped, but it lost none of its intensity. She said, "When I ran into that trading post, I was running for my life. Now, I am fighting for it, for my life, and for the lives of the people who took me in. I choose to be here. I choose this land, and I choose you. Ashki Nez." Her words were a lifeline thrown into the dark abyss of his grief. They did not erase the pain or the guilt, but they offered something else, a shared purpose. She was not a burden he had to protect. She was a partner who stood beside him, her resolve as strong as his own. The last of the formal mourning period ended. Ashki took a small clay jar containing his grandmother's ashes and walked to a high ledge overlooking the valley, a place where the wind always blew, a place that felt close to the sky. Eliza followed, but kept a respectful distance. He stood there for a long time, chanting a soft prayer, before gently tipping the jar and letting the wind carry the ashes, returning her to the land she loved. When he came back down, his eyes were still filled with sorrow, but the terrible emptiness was gone. He walked over to Eliza. He held out his hand. Lying on his palm was a simple string of blue and white beads, worn smooth with age. He said this was hers. She left it for me. He looked at the beads, then at Eliza. He said she told me it was to help me remember, to not let other men write my story for me. Eliza understood. It was not a charm against evil. It was a reminder of one's own truth, one's own path. It was Shandian's final lesson. They stood there as the sun set, the cliffs of the canyon walls glowing like the altars of some ancient, forgotten church. The air was cold and clean. The loss was a raw, open wound in their hearts. But from that wound, something new was beginning to grow. It was a vow, unspoken but perfectly understood. They would not let Shandian's death be a meaningless tragedy. They would make it a beginning. They would take the portfolio of maps, the ledger of lies, and her string of beads, and they would finish the pattern she had set them on. They would fight for this land, for its people, and for the memory of the woman who had taught them that the fiercest battles are won not with hate, but with a calm and unbreakable dignity. Grief is a quiet country, but they could not afford to live in it for long. The knowledge of the impending land auction was a ticking clock, each day a grain of sand falling toward a future where Cain's theft would be enshrined in law. With the rescued women safely integrated into the camp and Nathan standing guard, Ashki and Eliza knew they had to return to the heart of the serpent's den San Miguel. They rode under the cover of darkness, not as victims, but as insurgents carrying a secret weapon in a leather portfolio. Their first stop was not the hotel or the general store, but the sprawling livery stable at the quiet end of town. In the back, amidst the smell of hay and horsehide, a man was mending a saddle by lantern light. He was wiry and weathered, his face a testament to a life lived under the sun and sky. This was Lupe Reyes, a vaquero whose family had grazed their cattle in the southern plains for 100 years, long before the territory had a name. Until Beaumont Kane arrived with his fraudulent papers and his hired guns. Lupe had lost everything but his pride and his thirst for justice. He looked up as they entered, his hand never ceasing its work with the awl and thread. He nodded to Ashki, a greeting between men who understood each other without many words. He had known this day was coming. When Eliza laid the portfolio on the workbench and opened it to reveal the maps marking his family's stolen land, his dark eyes burned with a cold fire. He traced the lines of his ancestral pastures with a calloused finger. He said he has the law, the judge, the sheriff. What do we have? Eliza tapped the ledger she also carried. She said we have the truth. Their second meeting was more dangerous. Marshal Isaiah Booker's office was a small wooden box in the center of town, a symbol of a law that was rarely respected and often for sale. Booker himself was a man who seemed out of place. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a quiet dignity that was a stark contrast to the town's rough chaos. He wore his uniform with a crisp precision, a habit from his years as a buffalo soldier, and his eyes missed nothing. He had seen Kane's corruption grow, had been forced to stand by, his authority undermined by the wealth of the cattle baron and the complicity of the judge. They met him after midnight, slipping in through the back door. He listened to their story without interruption, his gaze moving from Ashki's stoic face to Eliza's impassioned one. He studied the ledger, his brow furrowed in concentration. He examined the faint imprint of the judge's seal, a ghost of a crime, and nodded slowly. He said, I have seen this man's work for 2 years. I have seen families driven from their homes. I have seen good men hang their heads in defeat. But my hands have been tied. The paperwork was always in order. He looked down at the ledger. He said this book unties them. But it was not enough to simply present the evidence. Kane and the judge would deny everything, bury the ledger in legal challenges, and use their power to discredit them. They needed more. They needed a public spectacle, an event so undeniable it would force the townspeople to finally choose a side. And so, in the dim lamplight of the marshal's office, a plan began to form. A desperate gamble with 2 sharp prongs. The first was Eliza's. She, with her knowledge of Kane's bookkeeping, would lead a raid on the Silver Spur rail station office, the nerve center of Kane's operation. They would not just steal the main ledgers. They would, with Booker's authority, officially seize them, hoping to find a clerk willing to testify in exchange for immunity. The second prong was Ashki's. He and Nathan, along with Lupe and a few of his loyal vaqueros, would intercept a special train scheduled to pass over the high wooden trestle at Silver Spur Bridge. The train was not carrying passengers. It was carrying the cattle and property seized from the very lands Kane was about to auction off, a final insult to the families he had ruined. Booker listened, his face impassive. When they finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he looked at them, a flicker of something long dormant in his eyes. He said the auction is in 2 days. The train is scheduled to cross the bridge tomorrow night. The station will be busy, preparing the manifests. It is the perfect time. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark, sleeping town. He said, tomorrow night, I will be called away on urgent business at the far end of the county. I will be very busy, and I will be very hard to find. It was not a promise of help, but something far more valuable, a promise to look the other way, to give them the one thing they needed most, a chance. They left the marshal's office and found a place to wait for the coming night, a small, abandoned adobe hut on the edge of town, its roof long since collapsed, leaving it open to the sky. The stars were a brilliant, glittering canopy overhead, so close it felt as if you could reach up and touch them. The distant, tinny sound of a piano from a saloon was the only reminder of the world they were about to confront. They built a small, smokeless fire. The night was cold, and they huddled close to its meager warmth. Eliza noticed a long, shallow cut on the back of Ashki's hand, a souvenir from the raid at Crow's Gulch. Without a word, she took out a clean cloth from her satchel. dampened it from her canteen, and began to gently clean the wound. He watched her, his usual stillness charged with an unspoken emotion. Her touch was gentle, careful, an act of quiet intimacy that went beyond words. They shared a corn cake, the last of the food they had brought from the camp, breaking it in half and eating in a comfortable silence. The simple act of sharing a meal under the stars felt like a prayer. Eliza found herself speaking of her mother, of a childhood kitchen that always smelled of cinnamon and baking bread, a place where she had always felt safe. It was a memory she had not allowed herself to visit for a long time. Ashki, in turn, spoke of Shandian, not of her death, but of watching her hands as she worked at the loom, how they moved with such certainty, weaving threads of color and light into a pattern only she could see. They were sharing the pieces of themselves that had been shaped by love, building a bridge of memory and trust in the darkness. The fire burned down to glowing embers. The silence that fell between them was no longer empty. It was filled with everything they had been through, with the grief, the fear, and the fierce, protective bond that had grown between them. Eliza looked at Ashki, his face illuminated by the soft red glow, the sharp lines of his profile, the steady calm in his eyes, the strength that was not in his muscles but in his spirit. He had been her protector, her teacher, but now she saw him as something more. She leaned forward and gently, hesitantly, pressed her lips to his. It was a touch as soft as moth's wings, a question asked without words. For a moment, he remained perfectly still, a man carved from stone. Then, a shudder went through him, a deep tremor that seemed to start from the very center of his being. He did not pull her closer, but the hand resting at his side clenched into a tight fist, a sign of the immense effort of his restraint. He drew back just enough to look at her, his eyes dark and burning with an intensity that took her breath away. His voice, when he spoke, was a ragged whisper, a sound raw with an emotion he had held in check for so long. "You've set me on fire. Love." The words were a confession, a surrender. It was not a prelude to a frantic passion, but a moment of profound recognition, an acknowledgement of the powerful, dangerous, and beautiful thing that had taken root between them in the heart of the desert. In that instant, under the silent witness of the stars, their separate causes became one. They were no longer just a warrior and a woman with a ledger. They were partners, bound by a shared commitment to justice and by a love that had been forged in the crucible of loss and defiance. As the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, they reviewed the plan one last time. They looked at each other, the vow they had made at Shandian's passing now sealed with a kiss. The passion that had been ignited between them was now focused outward, a single, unwavering flame. It was the spark that would either light a signal fire for justice or burn everything they held dear to the ground. The night air over Silver Spur was thin and cold, charged with an electric tension. Far to the east, a single point of light appeared, the headlamp of the midnight train, a mechanical beast racing toward its appointment on the high wooden trestle. Down below, in the cluster of buildings that served the railroad, another light burned in the window of the station office, a solitary beacon in the darkness. 2 stages were set for a single, desperate play. At the station, Eliza moved through the shadows with Lupe Reyes at her side. His presence was a silent reassurance, his weathered face calm, but his eyes missing nothing. Marshal Booker had done his part. The usual night guard was conspicuously absent, replaced by a single, green clerk named Thomas, who was known more for his spectacles than his spine. They slipped in through the unlocked back door, their footsteps muffled by the clatter of the telegraph machine. Thomas looked up from his paperwork, his eyes wide with terror behind his thick glasses. Before he could cry out, Lupe had moved behind him, placing a firm, heavy hand on his shoulder. It was not a violent gesture, but it carried an unmistakable weight of consequence. Eliza stepped into the lamplight, her face pale but her expression resolute. She did not raise her voice. She said, "We are not here to hurt you. Thomas, we are here for the real ledgers. The ones Mr. Kane keeps in the floor safe." She placed her own ledger on the desk, its worn leather a stark contrast to the neat stacks of official manifests. She said, "Your boss is a thief. This book proves it. We are here to stop him." The young man trembled, shaking his head. "He could not. Mr. Kane would ruin him." Eliza's voice softened, but her eyes were like steel. She said, "Mr. Kane is already ruined. You have a choice. You can be the man who helped a criminal, or you can be the man who helped save this town." She opened her ledger to the page with the faint imprint of the judge's seal. She said, "Judge Thorne is his partner. We have proof. When this is over, everyone associated with them will fall. Where do you want to be standing when that happens?" While she spoke, Lupe moved silently around the office. His eyes scanned the room, and with the practiced ease of a man who knows how things are hidden, he knelt and lifted a loose floorboard beneath the desk. Below it was a small iron safe. He looked at Thomas. The clerk's resolve crumbled. With shaking hands, he gave Lupe the key from a chain around his neck. Inside the safe were two thick, heavy ledgers, the true record of Kane's empire, and a small, velvet-lined box. Eliza opened the box. There, nestled in the dark fabric, was a heavy brass seal press. On its face was the image of an eagle clutching a set of scales. It was the official seal of Judge Marcus Thorne. They had him. Miles away, the train's whistle shrieked as it approached the deep gorge spanned by the Silver Spur Bridge. Ashki, Nathan, and a half-dozen of Lupe's vaqueros lay in wait among the rocks. They had dragged several heavy logs across the tracks at the far end of the bridge, an undeniable barricade. As the train rumbled onto the trestle, its wheels thundering on the heavy timbers, the engineer saw the obstruction. He slammed on the brakes. The massive engine screamed in protest, a terrible, high-pitched shriek of metal on metal, sending a shower of orange sparks into the dry timbers below. The train shuddered to a halt, its heavy cars swaying precariously over the dark chasm. Before the train crew could react, Ashki's team swarmed the cars. They were not a raiding party. They were a liberation army. Nathan used a heavy crowbar to break the locks on the cattle cars. The doors slid open, and the terrified animals, stolen from a dozen different families, bellowed and scrambled out, their hooves clattering on the wooden planks. The vaqueros expertly herded them off the bridge and into the darkness. Others opened the freight cars, finding furniture, tools, and personal belongings, the entire contents of homesteads that had been systematically erased. The operation was a model of controlled chaos, but it was not destined to remain that way. Headlights appeared on the road that ran parallel to the tracks. A carriage and a dozen men on horseback were approaching at a full gallop. Beaumont Kane had been alerted. He had come to personally oversee his plunder, and he had stumbled into their trap. The night exploded into a maelstrom of noise and violence. Kane and his men leaped from their horses, taking cover behind the rocks and opening fire. Bullets splintered the wooden railings of the bridge, whining and ricocheting off the steel of the train. Ashki and his men returned fire, the sharp cracks of their rifles echoing in the gorge. A stray shot from one of Kane's men shattered a lantern hanging from the caboose. It fell to the planks, spilling burning oil. A small flame flickered, then greedily licked at the dry, creosote-soaked wood. Within seconds, a wall of fire erupted, cutting off the back half of the train. The fire spread with terrifying speed, racing along the length of the trestle. The shouts of the gunfight were now mixed with the panicked bellows of the few cattle still trapped in the roar of the growing inferno. The bridge, Kane's artery of theft, was becoming his funeral pyre. From the town, people had begun to gather, drawn by the sounds of the battle. They stood on the bluffs overlooking the gorge, a silent, growing crowd of witnesses. Kane, enraged, saw his prize going up in flames. He led a charge onto the bridge, his face a mask of fury. But the fire was faster than he was, a heavy support timber, eaten through by the flames, collapsed. A section of the track sagged, and two of Kane's men, caught off balance, plunged screaming into the chasm below. Kane himself was trapped, his leg pinned by a fallen, burning beam. The flames creeping closer, the gunfight faltered, replaced by the overwhelming roar of the fire. Ashki had a clear shot. Kane was helpless, his face illuminated by the flames that were about to consume him. The man who had destroyed so many lives, who had caused the death of his grandmother, was at his mercy. He raised his rifle. His finger tightened on the trigger. The faces of the townspeople on the bluff were watching him. They expected the savage, the final, brutal act of vengeance. But in that moment, Ashki heard Shandian's voice, not in his ears, but in his soul, a tool for cutting what is rotten, for freeing what is tangled, not a weapon for hate. He lowered the rifle. He turned to Nathan. He said, "We get them out, all of them." The decision was so unexpected it stunned everyone into a moment of silence. Then, Ashki and Nathan moved, not toward Kane, but toward two of Kane's own men who were trapped near the flames, their faces wild with terror. They began pulling them back, away from the collapsing section of the bridge. One of Kane's most loyal gunmen, seeing his boss pinned and Ashki's back turned, raised his pistol to take the killing shot. He never fired. From the shadows of the rocks, another shot rang out. The gunman cried out and dropped his pistol. His hand shattered. The Ute tracker stood there, his rifle smoking. He looked at Ashki, gave a single, sharp nod, and melted back into the night. The debt was paid. The moral force of Ashki's action was more powerful than any bullet. The townspeople on the bluff began to surge forward, their fear replaced by a sudden, overwhelming sense of shame and admiration. Lupe's vaqueros, following Ashki's lead, began helping their enemies, pulling the wounded away from the flames. At that exact moment, two figures appeared at the edge of the crowd. Marshal Isaiah Booker, no longer busy at the far end of the county, had a firm grip on the arm of a sputtering, terrified Judge Thorne. Booker's voice boomed over the roar of the fire. He said, "Beaumont Kane, by the authority of the Arizona Territory, you are under arrest for fraud, theft, and conspiracy." Eliza stepped out of the crowd, the captured ledgers in her arms. She walked to the edge of the bluff, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes blazing with a righteous fire. She looked down at Kane, still pinned by the beam, his empire burning around him. She opened one of the ledgers. Her voice, clear and steady, carried across the gorge. She read an entry. October 3rd, 1871. For services rendered in the fraudulent transfer of the Miller family homestead, $500. Paid to Judge Marcus Thorne. A gasp went through the crowd. The Millers were there, a destitute family who had been driven from their land a week ago. Eliza did not stop. She read another name, and another, each one a nail in Kane's coffin. She was no longer a victim. She was the voice of their collective pain, the instrument of a justice they had thought was lost forever. The burning bridge groaned, a final, terrible sound, and another section collapsed into the gorge. The path of corruption was broken. Ashki, his face grim in the firelight, had chosen mercy over vengeance, and in doing so, had won a battle for the very soul of the town. Justice, raw and imperfect, had finally taken shape in the light of the flames. The dawn that broke over San Miguel was unlike any other. The sun rose on a town that had been fundamentally altered, not by a storm or a fire, but by a shift in its own soul. The smoldering ruins of the Silver Spur Bridge stood as a stark monument to the night's events, a black, broken scar on the landscape. But in the dusty streets, something new was taking root. The suffocating fear that had been the town's daily bread was gone, replaced by a nervous, uncertain, but undeniable sense of possibility. Beaumont Kane had been pulled from the wreckage of the bridge, his leg crushed by the burning timber. He was a prisoner now, his reign of terror ending not with a bang, but with the pathetic whimpers of a man in pain. Judge Thorne was held in the marshal's office, his face a mask of indignant fury, his blustering threats falling on deaf ears. The tide had turned. Justice, however, was a complicated machine, and its gears were rusted from disuse. With the circuit judge disgraced, Marshal Booker, with the tacit consent of the town's stunned and humbled leaders, convened a provisional hearing. It was not a formal trial, but a grand jury of sorts, an assembly of the people to hear the evidence and decide the course of action. The saloon was cleared of its tables and chairs, its floor swept clean of the previous night's debris, and transformed into a makeshift courtroom. Sunlight streamed through the dirty windows, illuminating the swirling dust motes, making the entire proceeding feel both momentous and profoundly fragile. The whole town seemed to be there, packed into the room and spilling out into the street. They were not a mob crying for blood. They were a quiet, sober assembly of witnesses, their faces a mixture of shame, curiosity, and a dawning hope. Eliza was the first to be called. She walked to the front of the room, the heavy ledgers clutched in her hands. She was not the terrified girl who had run from Kane's men. She stood tall, her voice clear and steady as she was sworn in by Marshal Booker. She did not speak of her own fear or of the threats against her. She spoke of facts, with methodical precision. She opened the ledgers and began to read. She unraveled the complex web of Kane's corruption, translating the cold, hard numbers into a devastating story of theft and deceit. She explained how Kane had used the railroad's expansion as a cover, creating shell companies and forging documents to claim land he had no right to. She pointed out the payments to Judge Thorne, disguised as legal fees. She detailed the systematic seizure of water rights, the lifeblood of this arid land, and showed how he had used that control to strangle homesteads and ranches, forcing families to sell for pennies on the dollar or simply abandon their homes. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the saloon. The evidence was irrefutable, laid bare for all to see. Judge Thorne leaped to his feet, his face purple with rage, and accused her of being a liar, a hysterical woman scorned. But his words had no power here. The numbers in the ledgers did not lie. Then Marshal Booker called the next witnesses. The women who had been rescued from Crow's Gulch came forward. One of them, a young Mexican woman named Elena, her voice barely a whisper, but her eyes burning with a fire that would never be extinguished, told her story. She spoke of how Kane's men had driven her family from their small farm, how they had taken her and the others, and the degradation they had suffered. Her testimony was not about finances or legal documents. It was about the human cost, the quiet suffering that had been the foundation of Kane's empire. When she finished, there was not a sound in the room, save for the quiet weeping of the Miller family. Ashki sat at the back of the room with Nathan and Lupe. He did not speak. He did not need to. His actions at the bridge had spoken for him. He watched Eliza, a quiet pride in his eyes. He saw the weaver his grandmother had spoken of, a woman finishing her pattern with courage and grace. He felt no triumph, no thirst for revenge. He simply observed, a calm center in the swirling currents of change. He knew that this was only the beginning. Kane had powerful partners in the territorial capital, men who would not see their profitable enterprise dismantled without a fight. Justice was not a single event, but a long, hard road. That night, as Kane lay under guard in a locked storeroom behind the general store, his arrogance returned. Believing he could still bluff his way out, he made his final, fatal miscalculation. The storeroom was where Marshal Booker had stored the mountain of confiscated documents, the original deeds and papers seized from the rail station. Seeing his chance to destroy the evidence against him, Kane used a small lamp to set fire to a pile of papers. But the dry, dusty room, filled with brittle paper and wooden crates, went up in flames with an explosive force he had not anticipated. The fire engulfed the room in seconds. In his panic to escape, the injured Kane stumbled and fell, a heavy crate of tinned goods toppling over and pinning his good leg. He was saved from the flames by the quick actions of the guards, but not before his own fire had seared his arms and face. He had survived, but he was a broken man. His body and his empire turned to ash by the same self-destructive fire. He was a victim of his own desperate greed, a tragedy of his own making. The events of the last 24 hours had broken the spell of fear and apathy that had held San Miguel in its grip. The next day, the town council met, this time with new members at the table, Lupe Reyes representing the displaced Mexican families, and a respected Dune elder who had come with Nathan. Ashki was invited, but he deferred, saying that Nathan spoke for his people. A new spirit of cooperation, born of shared crisis, was in the air. A plan was put forth, not to return all the land that was a legal tangle that would take years to unravel, but to take the vast tracts that Cain had not yet sold and lease them back to the families who had been displaced, both Dine and White, for a nominal fee. It was an imperfect solution, a compromise, but it was a start. It was an acknowledgement of a shared community, a shared future. After the hearing, as Eliza was helping Marshal Booker catalog the salvaged evidence, a timid voice called her name. It was Thomas, the young clerk from the rail station. His face was pale, and he wrung his hands nervously. He said he was ashamed. He knew what Cain was doing was wrong, but he had been too afraid to speak up. He said he was a good bookkeeper, and he knew where all the hidden accounts were. He offered to work for no pay, to help Eliza and the marshal unravel the full extent of Cain's network. He did not want forgiveness, only a chance to do something right. Eliza looked at the young man and saw not a coward, but someone who had found his courage late. She accepted his offer. The healing of a community, she was learning, was built on such small, individual acts of redemption. Later that evening, Marshal Booker walked into his office, where Judge Thorne sat under guard. He carried the heavy brass seal press. He placed it on the desk in front of the judge. Booker said, "Your service to this community is over. Marcus," he picked up the seal, the symbol of the authority Thorne had so thoroughly betrayed, and locked it away in his desk. The simple action was a final, quiet punctuation mark on an era of corruption. As dusk settled, painting the sky in soft shades of purple and orange, Eliza and Ashki stood on the bluff overlooking the town. The air was still thick with the smell of smoke, but it was mingling now with the scent of cook fires from homes where families were beginning to hope again. They were not naive. They knew Cain's powerful friends would not simply disappear. The fight for a lasting justice was far from over. But as they looked down at the flickering lights of San Miguel, they saw not a den of thieves, but a community that had, however imperfectly, begun to heal itself. They had walked through fire, faced loss, and had come out the other side, not unscathed, but unbroken. A fragile dawn had arrived, and with it, the quiet, shared promise of whatever would come next. The aftermath of a storm is not peace, but a profound and weary quiet. In the weeks that followed the fall of Beaumont Cain, the town of San Miguel existed in that quiet, taking stock of its broken pieces and cautiously beginning to imagine a new shape for itself, for Ashki and Eliza. The victory felt less like an ending and more like the clearing of a path. The question that lingered in the still air was where that path would lead. They did not wish to stay in the camp of the Cottonwoods, a place now forever shaded by the memory of Shandian's death. Nor did they belong in the dusty streets of San Miguel. They sought a place that was neither, and yet a little of both. They found it a half-day's ride from town, in a small, sheltered valley fed by a reliable spring that trickled from the base of a red rock canyon. The place was called Canyon Springs. It had good water, a stand of tall pines for timber, and a wide, flat meadow where the sun fell warm and bright. It was a place to put down roots. Building their home was a slow and deliberate conversation between two worlds. Ashki, with Nathan's help, raised the main structure. Not a traditional hogan, but a sturdy cabin of notched pine logs. Yet he built it on a circular foundation, and the roof had the gentle, sloping dome of the Dine Way. It was a house that looked to the four directions. Eliza, working alongside them, chinked the gaps with a mixture of mud and grass. Her hands, once accustomed only to the smooth glide of a pen, growing calloused and capable. She planned the windows to catch the morning light and insisted on a wide, covered porch where they could sit and watch the evening shadows stretch across the valley. It was neither a white man's cabin nor a Navajo hogan. It was theirs. As the house took shape, so did their future. One clear autumn afternoon, when the air was crisp and the sky was a deep, aching blue, they were married. There was no church, no grand pronouncements. They stood before their unfinished home, on the land they had chosen. Marshal Booker came, his uniform brushed and his face solemn, and stood as a witness for the territory. Lupe Reyes was there, his hat in his hands, his presence a quiet blessing. Nathan came, and with him, a Dine elder, a singer of the old songs, the town's new pastor, a young, earnest man who believed his God was big enough for all kinds of people, read a simple passage from his book. Then the Dine elder chanted a blessing, his voice rising and falling like the wind in the canyon, asking the holy people to grant them a long life and a beautiful trail to walk together. They exchanged no rings, only a quiet vow, a promise understood in two languages and witnessed by the friends who had become their family. Their new family, however, was not yet complete. Among the women rescued from Crow's Gulch was a small, silent girl of about 7 named Maria. Her parents had been killed when Cain's men seized their small plot of land south of the border. In the camp, the child had been like a ghost, her large, dark eyes watching everything, her voice never rising above a whisper. She had attached herself to Eliza, following her like a shadow, watching her as she worked at the loom that had been moved from Shandian's hogan to their new home. One evening, as Eliza was showing her how to card wool, Maria spoke for the first time, asking in a small voice if she could stay. The question was not directed at Eliza, but at the empty space beside her, as if she were too afraid to ask for anything for herself. Eliza looked at Ashki, who had been carving a piece of wood on the porch. He had been watching them, his face unreadable. He put down his carving, came inside, and knelt before the small girl. He did not speak, but simply held out his hand. After a long moment, Maria placed her tiny, trembling hand in his. The decision was made. Love, they were both learning, was not a feeling to be possessed, but a responsibility to be met. Maria became their daughter. Time began to flow in the rhythm of the seasons. Spring brought the hard work of plowing the meadow and planting corn. Squash and beans, the 3 sacred sisters of the Dine. Ashki taught Eliza how to read the soil, to know when it was ready, and they planted the seeds together. A shared prayer for the future. That summer, as the corn grew tall and green, Eliza's own life came into full bloom. She gave birth to a son, a healthy, strong-limbed boy with his father's calm eyes and a tuft of his mother's sunny hair. They named him Ho-Ho, a Dine word that meant peace, balance, and the beauty of a world in harmony. Their family was now a tapestry woven from 3 different threads, creating a pattern that was new and strong. With 2 children to care for and a homestead to run, Eliza's life was full, but she saw a need that went beyond her own small family. The children of the displaced families, both Dine and Mexican, had no school, no access to the world of letters and numbers that she knew was a form of power. She started a school. It had no building and no bell. It was simply a blanket spread under the shade of a large cottonwood tree by the spring. Every morning, a small group of children would gather, Maria among them, and Eliza would teach them their letters using a charred stick on a smooth piece of slate. She taught them to add and subtract, and she read to them from the few books she owned. It was a small act, but it was an act of profound hope, a planting of seeds in the minds of the next generation. Their home became a crossroads. Nathan was a frequent visitor, often bringing news from the Danelands and sitting for hours in comfortable silence with Ashki on the porch. Lupe Reyes would ride up from the south, his saddlebags filled with chilies and stories, his laughter echoing in the small valley. And once a month, Marshal Booker would make the ride from San Miguel, his official visit an excuse to escape the confines of the town and share a meal with the friends he had made in the fire. Their porch was the meeting place of the New West, a place where a Navajo, a vaquero, a former Buffalo soldier, and a schoolteacher from the East could sit and speak not as representatives of their people, but as friends. But the land was a hard partner. The second summer after they settled, the rains did not come. The sky remained a pale, unforgiving blue day after day. The spring slowed to a trickle, and the corn in the meadow began to curl and yellow. The specter of drought, the ancient enemy of all who live in the desert, settled over the valley. The conflict was no longer against a greedy man, but against the vast, impersonal power of nature itself. They dug the spring out, deepening the pool, but it was not enough. Ashki, using the knowledge passed down through generations, showed them how to find seeps of water at the base of the cliffs, how to collect the precious drops. They rationed their use, every bucket of water measured and precious. Lupe and his people, who had also settled nearby, shared what they had, and they, in turn, shared their meager harvest. The crisis did not break them. It forged their new community into something stronger, a bond tempered not just by a shared enemy, but by a shared struggle for survival. They were learning that freedom was not just the absence of oppression, but the presence of cooperation. One hot afternoon in late summer, as the fate of their crop hung in the balance, Marshal Booker rode into the valley. He was not on a social call. He carried a letter, an official dispatch with a seal from Washington. He read it aloud as they gathered on the porch. The letter stated that, based on the evidence provided by the citizens' hearing in San Miguel and the confiscated ledgers, the federal government was launching a full investigation into the land grant practices of the entire territory. A special prosecutor had been appointed. The network of powerful men who had backed Beaumont Kane was about to be exposed to the harsh light of federal scrutiny. Their small, desperate fight on a burning bridge had sent a shockwave all the way to the nation's capital. That evening, as if in response to the news, the sky finally broke. Dark, heavy clouds rolled in from the mountains, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, kicking up the dust and releasing the sweet, earthy smell of the desert after a long thirst. It was not a storm, but a slow, steady, life-giving rain. Ashki stood on the porch, his infant son asleep in his arms, watching the waters soak into the grateful earth. Eliza came and stood beside him, Maria holding her hand. They watched the rain, listening to its soft, drumming rhythm on the roof of the home they had built together. Happiness, Eliza thought, was not a destination. It was this, the hard, honest work of your own hands, the love of a family you had chosen, the quiet strength of friends. It was the simple, profound beauty of the rain falling on a thirsty field of corn. It was the harvest of a life planted in courage and watered with hope. 3 autumns had come and gone, each one painting the cottonwood leaves in the valley a more brilliant shade of gold. The raw, unfinished look of the homestead at Canyon Springs had softened, settling into the landscape as if it had always been there. The pine logs of the cabin had weathered to a gentle silver, and a thick vine of wild roses, planted by Eliza, now climbed the posts of the porch. The fields they had planted in desperation were now a patchwork of gold and green. The corn harvested and stacked, the squash ripening on the vine. The spring still trickled from the rocks, a steady, faithful heartbeat for the small community that had taken root around it. The children were the truest measure of the passing time. Hozo was now a sturdy toddler of 3, his laughter a constant echo in the valley as he chased butterflies with the clumsy determination of the very young. Maria, at 10, had shed the silent, haunted shell of the girl they had rescued. She was bright and quick, her voice now clear and confident as she helped Eliza with the younger children who came each day for their lessons under the shade of the big cottonwood. The world had changed beyond their small valley as well. San Miguel was a different town. The fear that had once been its primary currency had been replaced by a grudging, hard-won sense of community. A public well now stood in the center of the square, a project funded by the town council and built with the labor of men who had once stood on opposite sides of a bitter divide. The market was a place of fair trade, where the prices were the same for Lupe's vaqueros as they were for the established ranchers. Eliza's small school had inspired the town to expand its own, and the new schoolhouse now welcomed children of all backgrounds. The progress was slow, and the old prejudices still lingered in the shadows. But the balance of power had shifted. Justice was no longer a commodity to be bought and sold. One afternoon, as a cool wind blew from the distant, snow-capped peaks, carrying the first clean scent of winter, Marshal Booker rode into the valley. He no longer looked like a solitary lawman holding a fragile line, but a respected elder of the community. His face relaxed into the easy lines of a man at peace with his work. He carried a thick envelope bearing the official seal of the territorial capital, and another, smaller package wrapped in oilcloth. They gathered on the porch, Ashki, Eliza, Nathan, and Lupe, who was visiting for the week. Marshal Booker opened the official letter and read it aloud. The federal investigation, prompted by their actions 3 years prior, had concluded. The grand jury had handed down its indictments. The powerful men in the capital who had been Beaumont Kane's silent partners were named and charged. Every land deed signed by Judge Thorne and backed by Kane's forged paperwork was declared null and void. The letter ended with a final, stunning provision: a significant portion of the contested lands, including the sacred grounds near Canyon de Chelly, was being officially returned to the stewardship of the dying people. A long, profound silence followed the reading. It was not a victory that could be celebrated with cheers. It was too heavy for that. Bought at too high a price, it was a vindication, a slow, grinding turn of a great wheel that had finally come to rest on the side of justice. Nathan looked out at the valley, his eyes shining with unshed tears, and simply nodded. Then Booker handed the oilcloth package to Ashki. He said a man left this in town for you, said you would know who it was from. Ashki unwrapped it carefully. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft rabbit fur, was a simple flute, carved from a piece of river willow. It was smooth and unadorned, but perfectly made. With it was a small piece of paper, on which a message had been written in a neat, careful hand. The note was short. It said, "For the boy. The debt is paid. Friendship remains." Ashki knew at once who it was from: the Ute tracker, a man bound by his own code of honor, who had balanced the scales of his life in this final, quiet gesture. A conflict that had begun with a rifle pointed at them on a dark ridge had ended with a gift of music for their son. Ashki held the flute, a symbol of a peace he had never expected to find. That evening, the chill in the air drove them to build a large fire in the meadow. The stars emerged, a cold, diamond-sharp dust scattered across the immense blackness of the desert sky. The children, wrapped in warm blankets, sat close to the flames, their faces glowing with a mixture of firelight and wonder. Ashki, with Hozo sleeping peacefully in his lap, began to tell a story. He did not speak of the long walk or of the battles his people had fought. He spoke of his grandmother, Shandian. He told the children how she could read the patterns in the clouds and predict the rain, how she knew the names of all the plants and what they were for, and how she believed that weaving a blanket was a way of weaving beauty into the world. He was passing on her spirit, ensuring that the true legacy of his people, a legacy of wisdom and resilience, would not be forgotten. A little way off, Eliza sat with Maria and 2 other children from the valley. A book lay open in her lap, and by the light of a lantern, she was reading to them, her voice a soft, steady murmur against the crackle of the fire. She was no longer just a teacher of letters, but a guardian of stories, opening up new worlds for children who had once been taught that their own world was small and without hope. Maria and another boy, Lupe's youngest son, soon grew restless and began a game of chase along the banks of the stream, their laughter like the chiming of small bells in the quiet night. Eliza watched them, a deep, quiet happiness settling in her heart. She looked over at Ashki, who was watching her as well. Their eyes met across the flickering flames, and, in that shared glance, the entire journey of the past 4 years was present. The terror of the trading post, the desperate flight into the storm, the first shared meal in the slot canyon, the grief that had almost broken them, and the hesitant kiss under a canopy of stars. It was a lifetime lived in a handful of seasons. They had come to this land seeking escape and had found a home. They had fought for justice and had discovered community. Their love had not been a magic spell that vanquished evil. It had been something quieter and far more powerful. It had been the anchor that held them steady in the storm, the silent vow that gave each of them the courage to become the person the other needed. It did not save them from the world. It gave them the strength to save themselves, and in doing so, to help build a new one. Later, after the children were asleep and their friends had departed, they stood together inside their cabin. On the main wall, 2 objects hung side by side. One was the battle code, its woven patterns telling the story of a people's endurance, a warrior's promise of protection. Beside it stood the loom, a new blanket half finished upon it, its threads bright with the colors of the desert dawn. The warrior and the builder, the one who defends and the one who creates, were no longer separate. In this house, in this family, they had become one. Ashki gently placed the Ute Tracker's flute on the mantel beneath them, a final note of peace in their shared song. They had found their hozo, their balance, not in a perfect world, but in the beautiful, imperfect life they had woven together, thread by patient thread. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.